Welcome in. Thank you so much for joining us for our final webinar of the year, which promises to be a great one. We're joined by Dr. Camille Aquin with the topic of restoring voice, linguistic justice, literacy liberation, and the work of repair. I had the pleasure of listening to Dr. Aquin speak at Governor State University for a recent International Restorative Justice Conference. So I am so excited for her to share all of her work and research with the Zaire Institute community. We're going to give folks, as usual, about 2 minutes to roll in. While we wait, it's always great for folks to drop in the comments wherever you're watching from, where you're calling in from, where you're at. Introduce yourself, and then we will get started. And also, as always, be thinking about whatever questions you may have. We'll have a little bit of time at the end for 1 or 2 questions. So please be thinking of those. But yeah, we will give folks about another minute to join, and then I will have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Aquin. All right. Without further ado, welcome from Lexington, Kentucky, from Burlington. Great. Welcome in. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Aquin. Dr. Aquin has over 25 years of experience as a speech-language pathologist, working across private practice, hospitals, clinics, home health, public and private schools, and special education cooperatives. And she'll be drawing from all of that work in today's presentation. She specializes in serving African-American students and families in urban communities with a research focus on how PK through 12 educators perceive African-American vernacular English, or AAVE or AAVE, and the tools they need to distinguish AAVE from disorder. She has delivered a TED Talk, The Impact of Linguistic Bias, and presents at national and international conferences on topics including AAVE, disproportionality in special education, and culturally responsive teaching in urban education. Dr. Aquin holds licensure with the Illinois State Board of Education as a speech-language pathologist and director of special education, as well as certifications from the American Speech-Language Hearing Association and Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation. And I think that there is so much more to Dr. Aquin's narrative that I will allow her to introduce. Dr. Aquin, thank you so much for being here. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm so happy to be here with all of you and to share some of my work and some of the interests I have and some of the research that I've been able to conduct. You heard a little bit about me already. I just want to add that I'm also a mom and a wife. So you might hear some stories about my family, as I like to talk about them quite frequently. Those are my 15-year-old twin daughters that are there. And then my husband, who is so much fun to live with and to grow with over the last 25 years or so. You'll also hear a little bit about the program that I've just created here at Governor State University called Beyond the Margins, a restorative literacy initiative that we've implemented. I see a couple of my colleagues have already dropped their names in the chat, so glad they could be here with me. At the end of the day, though, I'm a speech-language pathologist. That's my training. I have a bachelor's and a master's degree in speech-language pathology, and then my doctorate's in special education. So I do live in that space of the special ed world as a speech-language pathologist with an overt interest in literacy skills, especially as it relates to the Black community. I also have a little private practice on the side in my spare time. I provide some speech services, but mostly it's special education administrative consultant work that I do. So all of that will shine through in a lot of the work that I'll be talking with you today. So today you'll hear a lot about AAVE, as I like to call it, African American Vernacular English, some of the research I've done, some of the implications of that research. We'll talk a little bit about literacy, and then hopefully we'll have some time at the end for questions and answers. So today you can expect to learn things about raciolinguistics. We'll talk about implicit bias, and then we'll spend a considerable amount of time really discussing how to differentiate between AAVE and as a disorder and or a difference. So that's usually what I'm talking about, is the misperception of AAVE as a disorder. So we'll talk a lot about that, and then how we as providers can respond once we've identified those dialectal differences in AAVE speakers. So first, let's define what AAVE is. And again, that's an acronym that I use to refer to African American Vernacular English, and I usually pronounce it as AAVE as opposed to AAVE. You may have heard other terms, Black language, AAE for African American English. You may have heard African American language. All of those terms mean the exact same thing. So when I'm saying AAVE, I'm referring to that exact same dialect that you may have learned about. First of all, AAVE is a dialect. It's a dialect of mainstream American English, just like any other dialect. We have Southern American dialect, dialects they speak out east. African American Vernacular English is just another dialect. It's often misperceived as errored speech, but it is classified as a dialect. It's probably one of the most researched dialects in our country, and still continues to be the least valued, unfortunately. So AAVE does have linguistic rules, just like any other dialect. And the way that you pronounce things, there are rule-based. About 80% of African Americans do speak this dialect, not all. But there are also pragmatic language skills that are closely related to social skills that are also consistent with AAVE. It's a marker of identity. It's important to the Black communities. And the origins of AAVE can be directly traced to the Atlantic slave trade. Essentially, the Africans that were trafficked over here did not speak the language, and a lot of those differences in their language was superimposed onto Southern American English, and AAVE was born and still exists for all of us today. AAVE is not slang. That's a misconception. Slang are terms that are fluid within any language. Right now, we've got like Riz, we've got 6-7. Those are examples of slang. It's not necessarily a part of a rule-based system that lasts for a very long time and can be clearly described as a language. AAVE is a dialect. It's not slang, okay? I've already mentioned that not all African Americans speak AAVE, and not all people that speak AAVE are African American. I spend a lot of my time, my free time, watching TV and movies, and I've found that the television show Blackish does a really good job of exemplifying that not all African Americans speak AAVE, and then the show Shameless does a great job of showing that you don't have to be African American in order to speak that dialect. Because dialects arrive from the people that you're around and the people that you spend the most time with. Shameless is a great example because they're raised, that household is in the south side of Chicago, and it's predominantly surrounded by a Black community that does speak AAVE. So that is exactly what the people there on the south side of Chicago also speak that dialect. In fact, there's this one episode within Shameless where they have one of the young boys who's speaking to his friends, and he's speaking in AAVE, and the director made the choice to write down the translation in mainstream American English for all the people who couldn't follow AAVE, to exemplify that there's a direct translation to the dialect that might be more familiar with you. So again, AAVE is a dialect. It's not slang. It's not bad English. It is a fully recognized dialect. As a speech language pathologist, I am licensed by ASHA, and ASHA also spends a lot of its energy talking about AAVE and the fact that it is a dialect and should not be misunderstood as something that is errored or wrong. I first learned about AAVE, even though I'm an AAVE speaker, I first learned about it as a dialect and not as bad English, which is kind of what was taught to me and what is still being, unfortunately, taught to many others. I learned about it as a dialect through my training as a speech language pathologist. And that's a picture of my grandfather there on the that you see there. And I remember learning AAVE really from him and being able to converse in AAVE with him. And so it really brought up a sense of pride in my family origin. When I first learned about this dialect in my 20s, it was this huge aha moment for me that there was something wrong with my perception of AAVE. So I like to remind myself of that's how I got started in this work, really, is really being fascinated in my conversations with my grandfather. But AAVE does have its own pragmatics, semantics, syntax, morphology, phonology. It is its own dialect. In fact, when I first learned about this in college in my 20s, I remember responding as like, no, that's not true. That's not accurate. Surely I couldn't have been wrong all these 20 some odd years. And in fact, it was a research project I was working on with one of my professors. And I remember she asked me to research something, and I can't remember what it was anymore. But instead, I spent the entire summer researching AAVE to prove her wrong. And I found that she was absolutely right. I found like over 70 rules within AAVE in my research that summer. And she was fascinated by it and allowed me to present on AAVE for her later on that summer. So AAVE is a dialect. In fact, just like I just said to you, I spent the summer researching and looking for rules. That was before this book was published. So there was this was back in the 1900s. We had those microfiche. Remember the microfiche? So I was researching and trying to find all these rules. And shortly after that, this is in 2002, Dr. Lisa Green published an entire book, like a book, y'all, with all the rules that she had found in AAVE. I'll just go through just a few of the rules that are listed within this book. When we speak in AAVE, we have our own way of conjugating verbs. So I'll talk about the to be verb because I think that that's one that most people are somewhat familiar with. So for example, the verb be actually marks that something is happening all the time. So we as AAVE speakers know that if you put that word be, it actually translates to something that means always or all the time. So if I said they be waking up early or they be waking up too early, that actually means always. Like my brain just automatically translates that when someone says that. It means the exact same thing for AAVE speakers. When we say something has been happening, that means that it's been happening for a long time. Like they've been waking up too early. We even say it a little differently, right? Like the vowel's a little different. It's more like been instead of been. But they've been waking up too early means that something's been happening for a very long time. So they've been waking up too early means they've been waking up too early, and this has been happening for a long time. And maybe I'm a little sick of it. Then if you don't put that to be verb in the sentence, it actually means that something is happening right now. So if I said they waking up too early, That means something's happening right now. So like he be calling my cell phone means he always calls my cell phone all the time, right? He been calling my cell phone means he's been calling me. You know, your man's been calling me for a long time. And he calling my cell phone means my cell phone is ringing right now. And he's calling me again. So that AAVE speakers, just we have this knowledge base of language that it's a little different for us the way that we conjugate verbs, and it has a very different meaning every single time. I like to point out too that uh, everyone's kind of jumping in on some of this work too. We have a well-known professor from Harvard who also is formulating an AAVE dictionary, and I absolutely love it. They've released little snippets here and there of some of the words they're considering, things like bus and woke. I just used the word salty the other day, but these are words that are pretty common in AAVE, and they are now compiling not just this book that Dr. Lisa Green has written, but also we're working on a whole dictionary that really exemplifies the rich language that is happening all around us in African American communities. I can't wait for that to come out. So the big problem is, like I alluded to, right? It's bias, the implicit bias, those attitudes, those stereotypes. I can sit and tell you, and I can research you. I even had to do the research myself, right, to prove like, oh, wow, it is a dialect. There are rules, but implicit bias still permeates and tells us that that this is errored speech and that this is wrong. Unfortunately, a lot of my time and energy and work is dedicated to that still, where I'm trying to convince others that we think of this as errored speech because of implicit bias, but in actuality, that's not true at all. And this implicit bias is so important because it impacts the way that we as educators, remember, I'm a speech language pathologist. I'm a, special educator, a special ed administrator. I love to work in those spaces as a speech language pathologist. And I'm fully aware that implicit bias impacts access to student success. If you think that this child is operating in this space that's negative or inferior, that is exactly how you'll approach that child. Research tells us that. It's so important that we have these positive viewpoints of our students. And for me, understanding and respecting and validating the language that our students who speak AAVE are bringing with them to school is a natural first step to consider. And this goes way beyond school. I'll talk a lot here about how it impacts educational success and access to quality education. I'll talk a lot about that in this talk. But I do want to pause and just remind everybody that these implications are far-reaching. School may be the first place that some of these issues might arise, but the longevity of the impact goes without question. And this is just one example of a research study that was completed that was looking at court reporters' ability to know and understand AAVE when they're on a witness stand. So there was this study, and this is just one example, where the witness actually said, an AAVE speaker said, he don't be in that neighborhood. Now, I know I can't really interact with you guys directly, but if you remember just a few slides back, I just taught you that be means all the time. He don't be in that neighborhood. Therefore, in AAVE translate, not only is he not in that neighborhood, he's never in that neighborhood. He never goes there. However, the court reporter wrote down, we going to be in this neighborhood, which is like the exact opposite, actually, of what the witness had stated. And of course, the implications of this are far, and the impact of this is huge, because think of all the juries, right, who just can't remember exactly what that one witness said. Hey, can I see the transcript? Well, the transcript is wrong. And if we didn't have someone who honored and knew, was fluent in AAVE, then it's possible that the jury never gets an accurate representation of what that witness said because they couldn't remember it in the moment, or they weren't fluent AAVE speakers in the moment. So really this disvalue, this seeming of like, let me write this down this way because this is what he meant to say, because obviously he's wrong. Those kinds of attitudes can have long-lasting impact on not just children that are in a school system, but then also anyone, no matter what your age. This can follow you and have a huge impact on you if you don't have this knowledge and value of AAVE. So here's some research that's been done on these very things, and they're looking at, what are educators' perception of AAVE. And by and large, this is about 10 years old when we were looking at this research to do a study, and the perceptions were that it's negative, that educators are like, oh, it's inadequate, it's inferior, we don't need to use any of that in the classroom setting. But in the same breath, they said, we're also not real prepared. I don't know what to do. Even if I identify that they speak AAVE, I don't know exactly what I'm going to do about that. So then we did a research study that looked at some of these things. Now, I just want to stop for a second here because this slide reminds me to explicitly state that that research that I was just talking to you about that says that they have these negative implications of AAVE, or these negative feelings towards AAVE. These are Black people. The majority of the people that filled that out were Black that filled this out. So I always like to stop and pause so that people don't think I'm talking to, any one demographic in particular, because I'm not. I'm talking to everyone, all of us. Remember my own story. I was well into my 20s before I realized that I had a negative impression of something that actually is quite legitimate and factual. So this is just a reminder for all of us that I'm talking to all of us, when I'm making these statements, because the people that filled that out were actually Black. This is so important because we have this phenomenon in our school system called disproportionality in special education. This term means that African American students are actually 2.5 times more likely to receive special education as compared to their white peers. Okay. It also means that there's this underrepresentation of gifted education amongst Black students. But I talk mostly about how that our special ed population is African Americans are 2.5 times more likely to receive these services. And this is mostly in those subjective categories, okay? Those subjective categories being that I, as the clinician or the educator, can say that my clinical judgment or my educational judgment has decided this child is eligible for specific learning disability or emotional disturbance or speech language impairment, right? All of those can be more subjective, and I'll give you some examples of that in just a second, why it can be more subjective. But to give you the flip side, as opposed to blindness, right? Or like deaf. We're not overrepresented in those kinds of categories, but we are overrepresented in things that can be a bit more subjective. I'll even add intellectual disability. Every now and then I get a student that I'm working with and I'm like, how on earth did you qualify for that? But it's because of a lot of times these subjective scores can come up, and these children, students, can qualify for those services. Those are subjective, okay? What are some reasons of this? What are some reasons we might have disproportionality? Well, one reason is that we have 16% of our public school population is African American, but we do have this cultural mismatch with white teachers and public school educators. We have this cultural mismatch, and we have this misunderstanding, right, of what I just talked about, of AAVE as being a legitimate language as opposed to a disorder. We also have very vague definitions of subjective disabilities, especially things like emotional disturbance. Some of it is criteria like, have they been sad for an extended period of time? Like, what does that even mean? There's no time stamp on that. So some of these things are quite subjective, and that's how a lot of times that our students can qualify for these services based on clinical judgment or educational judgment, our own thinking about the problem and how it should be addressed. Here's an example. This is an example of one of the exams that I give, and called the OWLS. And please hear me, I'm not necessarily saying anything bad about any of the tests that I'm getting ready to talk about. I'm just exemplifying how sometimes this can become more subjective, and how I, as a speech language pathologist and special ed administrator, have learned to handle some of these issues as they arise. So one of my favorite tests, actually, honestly, to give is the OWLS, because of its way of looking at language. It has a pretty nice pragmatic slant that I like to use when I'm providing an assessment of a child's language. But for my AAVE speakers, I'm very culturally responsive. I always include context when I'm making a decision about who should and should not qualify for services. This was just an example of, it reminds me of a student I was evaluating once, and the student, has to give you a certain answer based on the standardized test that I'm providing. This particular test was asking basically the question of, you just met your favorite artist. What might you ask for? And they're looking for autograph. Well, my kid said number. What would you ask for? And he was like, I might ask for her number. I'm like, you know what? You might. I don't know. You might ask for their number. In that context, and in the client that I was serving at the time, yes, I have to write down that they said number, and that's not what the OWLS is looking for. But then I also am able to apply my own clinical judgment and decide this isn't indicative of a disorder, though. So, however, someone else who gives that test may say just flat out, blatantly, you didn't give me the right answer, therefore you have a disorder. I tend to not do that. Even if my kid scores in a level or in a range that might be considered disordered by the test, I, as the clinician, I will review those tests and those answers and make a clinical judgment as to whether or not the nature of these responses are indicative of a disorder. So that's what I mean. I love the OWLS because I have a lot less, my students have a lot less opportunities for some of those kinds of differences. But when they occur, I still use my own clinical judgment. And it is my hope that others do the same. I train my students to do the same. This is just another example of that. This is a popular vocabulary test that I like to provide too. But it was during my work with AAVE speakers that I really became much more aware of differences in vocabulary. So again, even though I would get these students that would score consistently in a lot of the areas that I worked in, they would consistently score below that 85 threshold. But then I just started keeping like a running list of answers I can expect, and therefore I would use that as almost what I would call a local norm for the students that I was servicing. This is how I was able to address that problem of disproportionality in special education. I started to become much more responsive culturally, instead of just applying this one size fits all. So these are just a few examples on your screen. The expressive one word picture vocabulary test is looking at, I would show the picture of these footprints, right, to my students, but my students would consistently say feet instead of footprints, which technically is wrong according to the expressive one word picture vocabulary test. But of course, then I decided, yes, it's wrong. Their score is a little bit lower. But then I would come to the IEP meeting and I would talk to the family about sometimes when our students score below that 85 to 115 threshold, sometimes I'll look at the student and sometimes I'll look at the test. In this case, I'm looking at the test, and I will provide the family with their exact answers and explain why there's no concern here. And I'll put that in my report too. So yeah, you may see this low score, but my clinical judgment is saying that it's indicative of his environment, his community, and there's nothing wrong with this kid in terms of having a speech language disorder. So other examples are, there's a picture of a wall. A lot of times my kids would say bricks, skeleton, my kids would say bones, tire. A lot of times I heard wheel, fireplace. A lot of times I heard Santa or chimney, sometimes smoke. Furniture, consistently, they would just like name all the pieces of furniture and not say the word furniture. Sewing, top answer was, I have no idea. I don't know what that is. So I think that was just something that, people don't really see people sewing a lot anymore. Leopard, I usually heard tiger. Stool, I heard seat. And lobster, my number one answer there was bug. You have to remember this was, I have it all compiled on one page for you guys, one slide, but these are actually individual pages that I would show on an easel. So the pictures aren't really to scale. So it was sometimes it was a little difficult for them to make out, like, what is that supposed to be? But these are just examples of how I responded, because Black students are 2.5 times more likely to be identified as having a disorder. And in my clinical judgment, it's because of things like this. People weren't really doing their due diligence to embrace the language that our kids are already coming into school with as correct and normal. I love this test. This was the Cookie Monster test. I hate I can't see y'all. I don't know who's heard of this study before, but the Cookie Monster test was completed by Dr. Janice Jackson. And what she did was really trying to center AAVE as the norm in her test. Like how does it make you feel when, your responses are error, even though it's correct to you? Now we're going to make AAVE as the norm in this particular test. So what she did was she showed pictures to AAVE speakers and mainstream American English speakers, neither of which were bidialectal. So we had AAVE only and then mainstream American English only. And she showed them 2 pictures. She showed them a picture of Cookie Monster laying in bed sick, just like you're seeing there. And then she showed them the kids pictures of Elmo eating cookies. Okay, so, and then she would ask all the AAVE speakers, who be eating cookies? Now, you're looking at this picture of Cookie Monster, right? That's sitting in bed sick. But when you asked AAVE speakers, AAVE speaking children, who be eating cookies, because we know, remember, I just taught you this, when you insert be into a sentence, that means something is always happening. So those kiddos knew, looking at those pictures, well, who be eating cookies? Cookie Monster. Cookie Monster be eating the cookies, right? But all of the mainstream American English students all referred to Elmo. So it was just a way, for me, it did 2 things, right? It reinforces this knowledge base that AAVE has a rule-based system that is easily understood and interpreted by AAVE speakers. Even as small children, they were able to make that distinction of what be means in that sentence. And what I think my favorite part is that it really centers AAVE as the norm for a change instead of mainstream American English, which is lots of fun for me to see. So we had some questions, right? How are we preparing? I just told you, right? Our educators are saying, no, I think AAVE is inferior. I think it's negative. No, we shouldn't be doing any of these things, and I don't want to hear this in my classroom. But they're also saying, I don't know what to do, even if I did have an AAVE speaker. I don't even know what I would do. So I did this research study that was looking at perception of AAVE, but then also, what would you do if you did have an AAVE speaker with you? How would you respond? So I was looking at in-service teachers, which just means teachers that are actively working in the field, and then other support personnel. And I use this theoretical framework of raciolinguistics. Raciolinguistics, I love that this really embraces not just language, but then it also connects race, because it uses words like we don't just hear language, we see it too. If I tell you that there's a Spanish speaker right outside my door right now waving hello, you'll create this image of what this Spanish speaker looks like, right? Now, this may or may not be anything of what they look like, but you will automatically attach that language to a race. You'll attach it to a whole lot of different intersections like SES. All these different things will come into your mind. So raciolinguistics hits that assumption head on, that when we're talking about language, we're also talking about race and culture all at the same time. So I was using a raciolinguistic framework as I was approaching this research study. A lot of it was qualitative. I was looking at their perception. Remember that slide that I showed you that talked about how there were negative perceptions about AAVE, and that a majority of them, of the people that filled that out, were actually Black. So I took some demographic information as well. But I'm looking at their perception. I asked them some questions. I was looking specifically at educators that are in the field to see how they would respond to vignettes, or just short little writing samples of narratives by third grade students written in AAVE. I had 2 written in AAVE and 2 written in mainstream American English. And I had a simple question: would you refer this student to special education? Yes or no? And they had to answer that. And then they had to explain why. The questions, to really gather some of the demographic, they did have the option to not respond, but most did, and they had to tell me yes or no, why they chose that, and then they had to complete a perception survey using 25 different questions, and using a Likert scale to tell me about their impressions of AAVE. This is just an example of what that survey looked like by Champion et al. That I used in this particular research study. And this is an example of the vignettes that were presented to the participants. We had a boy named Lester, and then Amy and Olivia's adventure that are listed on your screen. It's important to note that these are all pulled directly from the research. They're not self-generated. They all have only rules that are in mainstream American English, or rules that are in AAVE, and none of them had any indicators of a disorder. And either of the 4, any of the 4 examples that were provided to the participants. I had 41 people complete this survey and answer these questions. This is just an example of what some of the demographics were of people that completed this. And then I was able to analyze all of this data to get some frequencies, percentages, and then I made some comparison of the participants' responses. Now, what I found that's most startling, excuse me, is that the vignettes that were written in AAVE were 6.5 times more likely to be sent for a special ed evaluation. So those were sent for an evaluation 6.5 times more frequently than the ones that were written in mainstream American English. And remember, my concern is disproportionality in special education. And disproportionality in special education, again, is the over diagnosis or the over eligibility of African Americans into special ed. And African Americans are 2.5 times more likely to be in special ed. And my studies show they were 6.5 times more likely to be referred at all. And, unfortunately, too, once you're referred and this testing starts going on, a lot of them will qualify. So I've spent a lot of energy really thinking about that referral process in our assessment tools and how we can really fine tune that process to mitigate disproportionality in special education. Here are some more results here. I found that our SLPs and then the general ed classroom teachers, and then I had some in the other category. And the other category included a lot of different kinds of, people. It could be like interventionists, but it could be like a math interventionist. But our speech language pathologists, I like to highlight, is that they were the only ones who actually identified AAVE by name when they were making a referral. Now, that's interesting to me because, as I told you, I first learned about AAVE in graduate school. It's a part of our requirement for ASHA. They require us to learn about different dialects and languages. So we knew about it, and then we had speech paths who did identify, yes, this is an AAVE speaker. Then they also referred them to special education at the exact same time. So that really speaks to that mismatch of understanding this is a language, but then also referring them as though they have special needs. That was in speech language pathology. That's one of the results that I found. I also found that a lot of great quotes here. All of the categories did refer to some area of special education in their responses, except for administrators. So administrators were the only ones that kind of stood back a little bit by naming us, by saying special ed by name. They're the only ones who didn't really say that in their referral answer, which is interesting. Administrators being director of special ed, and I also had superintendents that filled this out as well. And this also could be because there are laws now that are really strict that are looking at disproportionality in special education, and that could be why I think some of these administrators were a bit more cautious to make those generalizations. What else do I want you to know? Again, SLPs were the only ones that not only called it by name, they also named it a dialect. And then they also mentioned diversity, but again, they also still sent or made referrals to special education, which is very interesting when I'm thinking about how I'm trying to mitigate those concerns about disproportionality in special education. Now, speech paths, even though they sent to special ed, they did not say special ed by name too. So they said, I refer them for extra support and clicked yes. But in their explanation and their description, they didn't actually talk about special education by name. So it's easy to kind of look at that and wonder if that's the people that filled that out, the speech path that filled out, and ask yourself, is that their way of saying, oh, maybe there's something we could do, but I don't know if there's anything else I could refer them to. Right now we have special ed, and that's about it. So all of these things are really interesting to me because I know that there's this negative perception. I know also that people are saying, I don't know what to do, even when I recognize there is an AAVE speaker in front of me. Another thing that I found in my research too, in this research study, is that I was walking into this with the background knowledge that there's a negative perception of AAVE. However, I did find in my study, it wasn't positive, but it was neutral. So we're moving forward, right? In terms of understanding and acceptance. We're not quite there yet. Not negative, not positive, but kind of in the middle as neutral. So, to really think about how the speech path really responded of making this determination like, oh, they could use some support, special ed are my options, and that's why I'm sending them there. Because they didn't name special ed specifically. This brings me to this understanding that there really needs to be a way to embrace bidialectalism for my AAVE speakers in the classroom setting. We talk a lot about bilingualism, right? Spanish, English, French, English, Spanish, French. But what about bidialectalism? I'm bidialectal and proud of that I am bidialectal. I was raised in a situation where I had access to both dialects readily. Therefore, I am bidialectal. However, my work has put me in places where my students only have access to one dialect, and that's AAVE. And they are not necessarily bidialectal. And it's because they only have access to one dialect readily. They haven't been able to benefit from this explicit instruction in another language, i.e. mainstream American English, to promote bidialectalism. However, it's not just about being bidialectal, it's also about celebrating the dialect that my students do have, celebrating the culture, the language of African Americans, validating that dialect. So when teachers ask me or say things like, yes, I have an AAVE speaker, or speech path say things like, yes, I have an AAVE speaker, but I don't really know what to do, how to address bidialectalism. This is exactly what I talk to them about. First, we have to get to a place where we honor and respect AAVE and help the student celebrate their own culture, their own language, and then we can promote bidialectalism, openly acknowledging that there's this intersection between race, language, and the bias that comes along with being an AAVE speaker. Being open about those conversations with our students, with our educators as they're providing that instruction, is a really great place to get started when we're thinking about promoting bidialectalism in the classroom setting. This is my parents. my parents Arthur and Carol Bird, and they really exemplified code switching. So many of you probably know about code switching, and they exemplified it, code switching in my upbringing. Okay. Whereas, I spoke AAVE at home or at family gatherings. That picture I had of my grandfather, that's actually my dad's father. So, those kinds of settings, AAVE was spoken readily. And then when we were out in public or out, at school or wherever we were, at church, we would use mainstream American English. And there was no discussion about that. That was just how we were all raised, and it was expected and normal for us to approach and behave in that manner. My parents both have, My dad has a master's degree in education. My mom has, I don't know, 2 or 3 master's degrees. I think she's on here. She can tell you. She has 2 or 3 master's degree. She was an educator and, an administrator. So she, my upbringing, it was very different than some of the kiddos that I was serving. So I had access to 2 different dialects from the time I could breathe. And I was taught to use those 2 dialects separately in code switching. However, now, admittedly, I do a bit more code meshing, where I am using both dialects in all settings at most times, where there's this embodiment of combining or understanding that you can use you can use both dialects in all of these settings, and that's completely acceptable. Now, I want to be clear, right? Even our AAVE speakers, they're very aware of their dialect on some level, right? Because our use of AAVE will increase in informal settings, and there are often attempts at code switching, but without explicit instruction in all of the rules of AAVE versus mainstream American English, it's really difficult, to do that, without really having that understanding of all the different ways that you might interact with the 2 dialects, and then the different ways that they are not the same, and what words to use here and what sounds to pronounce there. So a lot of times that is needed, that explicit instruction. Because, let's be clear, right? Like the GRE and the ACT and the SAT and all those things aren't written in AAVE. So it's important that they have that knowledge base of how to be bi-dialectal, but to do that without embracing their first language of AAVE is highly discouraged. Excuse me. This is a great book, guys. Other People's English. It's actually a takeoff of Lisa Delpit's Other People's Children. So I do recommend this. It does a great job of really talking about code meshing, what that looks like in the culture of education, in classroom settings, really, dissecting this idea of what's correct and what's appropriate in different settings, and turning that on its head and helping us to understand that all language is correct. There's no superior language, there's no superior dialect, and that all of them have value. And once we can treat our students that way and evaluate them from that lens, it'll be very helpful to everybody. Excuse me. It's suddenly very dry in here. Translanguaging is a term that's gotten a lot of conversation lately, and it really bleeds nicely into this idea of code meshing. Translanguaging is used a lot already in bilingual education, and how we think about language, and how our students and our adults think about language, and how we embody all of these things at the exact same time. So when we're teaching and learning about language, focusing on the language of the heritage language, or the first language of the speaker, and using that as a catalyst to learn other languages. So translanguaging, it shows that you can convey and use all these different languages across different communities and different contexts. This is a great graphic that I created to really talk about that flow of raciolinguistics to translanguaging and then into code meshing. And to look at how they all work together, especially in the classroom setting. Raciolinguistics offers that critical lens and on racialized language ideologies. And then translanguaging really cultivates that language practice. And then code meshing is what it looks like in the classroom setting in real time. I love this. This is Dr. Julie Washington. If anyone is already doing some of this work or is familiar with some of this work about AAVE, Dr. Julie Washington will quickly come up in your research because she also had this aha moment. Mine was in college. Hers was when she was practicing as an SLP, and she was working with a young child on reading a book. And we often do our story retells. We read them a story and then they tell us back their story. And she read this one student, "Are You My Mother?" And the student was able to retell the story accurately, but Dr. Washington was struck by the fact that she was in dialect. But then she had this aha moment, like, of course she's in dialect. Why would I think she suddenly is going to switch dialects because she heard a story? So she read to her, "Are you my mother?" And then this girl starts to give back the story in Ave, and says, "Is you my mama?" And she's like, "No, I ain't none of your mama." So she tells this whole story, this beautiful story, in dialect. And so she had this aha moment. And Dr. Julie Washington has spent the rest of her career really working on, how can we capture the brilliance in our AAVE speakers and exemplify that so that we have less likelihood of people erroneously identifying them as having a disorder. So this is just one way to think about it, right? Is to really spend your time and energy focused on the comprehension of the text and the student's ability to comprehend that text. Really, it's a callback to what I do when I'm doing evaluations, right? I'm critically analyzing and say, oh, well, in this community or in this this place of residence where this place where this child is being raised, it makes perfectly sense that you would use this word versus that one. It makes perfect sense that you would conjugate your verb this way instead of that way. And that's what Dr. Julie Washington did. It's no different than what you and I would do, right? I'm looking at "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" right here on your screen in a very different dialect. I'm not going to try and read that to you in that dialect. I'm going to say it in my own, in my own dialect. And we all know what we're talking about. It's not wrong that I'm not saying it in dialect. It's just different. And that's really the basis of what I speak about when I'm talking. Here are some other examples of how AAVE might show up, not only in language, but in literacy skills when you're talking about writing. These are some other common differences in AAVE versus mainstream American English. For example, I'll take that first one, that substitution of the "duh" sound for the "th" sound. We might say "those" instead of "those," or "them" instead of "them." It's kind of like a flap almost, not like a hard D, but it's not a TH either. And that's okay. When you're taking in that information, you can mark it on your paper that they use "duh" for that, but it's not indicative of an error. That's really what is important there. I teach my students this here at Governor State University, and I just got a text message from one of my students who is in their external placement. And sure enough, she's got a 4-year-old Black child on her caseload who speaks AAVE, or at least this, my student suspected so. She texted, "Can we talk?" And we did. And she's like, "I think these are all the features of AAVE. It's only artic." And she's doing things like, we're working on "duh" for, or work on TH sound because she says "duh" for TH. I think that we're not supposed to be working on this, right? You taught me that this is AAVE. And I said, yes, you're absolutely right. And do you know, she advocated for this child and this family, and she was able to teach her SLP because the SLP that she was working with was very grateful. She's like, I didn't realize that we shouldn't be working on this in that same way, right? Think back on the SLPs that referred for special ed in my study. And they named it as AAVE, but this SLP was explained by one of my students. They're like, no, this is absolutely not appropriate. The student was able to educate the family and the staff on AAVE, and then that child was removed from an IEP, and the family was quite grateful to learn that their kiddo doesn't have an articulation disorder. So this is what this looks like in real time. I inherited these IEPs, and I reacted in a very similar way as my student, and I'm so very proud of her. These are just some of the examples. Again, Dr. Lisa Green has written a hefty book that does a great job of exemplifying all, an exhaustive list of all of the rules related to AAVE. Here's how else it shows up. This is my daughter when she was 9. I think she was 9 years old. This is Sophia. She's 15 now, but this is when she was 9 years old. She was in class, and the teachers like to a lot of times write sentences on the board for students to get practice on how to conjugate, or how to find errors in a sentence with punctuation, spelling, anything could pop up right in those examples. So one day though, her teacher wrote on the board, Mrs. Johnson, I think it was Mrs. Johnson, be organizing the fall festival. Well, Sophia's been coming to talks like these since she was a child, so she isn't fully aware that not everyone has this knowledge base. So she shot her hand up in her 3rd grade class and told her teacher and everybody else, all the students who were listening, that this is wrong, that you can't list sentence like that, because this is AAVE, which is a respectable language and very important to the Black community, and you need to take that down immediately. So she gave everybody an education on AAVE that day. But this is also another way where it kind of creeps in, where we are having these discussions about what is right, what is wrong, what is good language, what is bad language, and really kind of reinforcing some of those stereotypes that aren't even accurate, because AAVE is a language, and that is rule based. So sometimes the children will lead us. So Sophia shot her hand up and gave everyone an education that day. That teacher took that in though and called me later. It was a Black teacher who said she didn't know. She'd never heard of, AAVE being a dialect. So she was grateful for that information. It kind of validated her. She's like, okay, it makes me feel a lot better. Actually, it's not bad English. It's a dialect that I speak with my family. And she vowed, to really be more cognizant of what she's representing and presenting to others as disordered speech. Here's another study that I did with my colleague who's actually on the call here, where we were teaching special ed pre-teachers. So these were students that were in a university setting, undergraduate students that were learning to be special educators. And we put them into 2 different groups. One was an experimental group where we were teaching them AAVE. And the other group were also learning AAVE, but we weren't really teaching them AAVE, which is really indicative, right? It's really it exemplifies how we're expecting our students to learn, that speak AAVE. They're fluent in AAVE, but we're expecting them to learn mainstream American English almost by osmosis, because there's not necessarily that explicit instruction in those comparisons that I'm getting ready to show you that's happening in the instruction. So we had 2 groups. We had one group that we were explicitly teaching AAVE and how to translate. And then we had another group where it was just like, okay, here's what you need to translate this, figure it out. We had 5 different AAVE patterns that we looked at. The aspectual B here is the second one we have listed here. And that's the one we talked about earlier, where you insert B. That's the Cookie Monster test. So you insert B and something's always happening. We had stress bin, which is means something's been happening for a long time. We had copula absence, which just means when you don't have that be verb in there, it means something's happening right now. And then we had negation, where you put 2 negatives together. That's perfectly fine in AAVE. That's a whole sentence. And then preterite had all the way at the top. is like the simple past. Okay, he had gone upstairs. It's not like so it's a little different the way that we will use that. He had gone upstairs, or he went upstairs, or all kind of means the same thing to us. We did this for several weeks, and then we also had them complete a survey, or not, yeah, a survey, so that we could get an idea of their perception of AAVE. Remember, it's not just about the fact that AAVE is a rule-based system. It's also the perception people have of AAVE. That's really what we're fighting against. So we did a perception survey. It's a little different survey than I used in the last study that I just told you. This is a different survey, but it essentially is looking at a lot of the same things. What is the educator's perception of AAVE? These are some of the results that they had walking into the study. Many of them were very consistent with what I've already talked about. They disagreed, that should be used, that dialect should be used academically. They really weren't sure of, what to do with students who spoke AAVE. Well, even after identified it, they didn't know what to do. And they had, difficulty knowing that, how to identify it, and then how to respond, basically, for AAVE speakers as an educator in the classroom setting, and particularly special educators in a classroom setting. And they all agreed, not all, but most agreed, that they wanted to learn more about how to respond to that. So this is just an example of some of the instruction we provided when we were looking at, when we were talking to them about the to be verb. We provided them with, full instruction on not just what is the to be verb and how it's used in mainstream American English, but also how it's used in AAVE, so that they can make these determinations on how to translate back and forth between the two dialects. So these are just examples of what we would provide when we were trying to make sure that our students understood what was expected of them. And the students being these pre-service teachers, right? Like we would teach them. They working late means the same thing as they're at work right now, and they're going to be late, like they're working very late. All of that is what we mean when we don't have the to be verb. And then in mainstream American English, she's doing homework right now would translate into AAVE as she doing homework. We would make those explicit connections to many to our students in real time, and allow them to really participate in some of those guided practice drills before they would take a little test to make sure that they were getting it. This is just an example of what that might look like when they were translating. And I remember with the translation was expected from AAVE to MAE, and also from MAE to AAVE. So what I really like to highlight on this slide is that it was hard for them to learn AAVE. By and large, it was easier for them to learn to translate from AAVE to mainstream American English, and that to translate from mainstream American English to AAVE was hard. So I like to kind of boast that it's really hard to learn AAVE after this study. It's so complicated that the lay people have a difficulty understanding it and learning how to conjugate these verbs. So it was hard for them, especially for those who did not receive that in explicit instruction. Even though there were gains made over time, even with both groups, there were gains made over time. The ones who had explicit instruction made far greater gains than those who receive standard practice. Why am I telling you this? Because I strongly believe that explicit instruction will not only show that it helped our pre-teachers, but it also could be very beneficial to our youth that are coming to school for the very first time with a language of their own, and expectations set by the school system, but very little explicit instruction in how to make those connections with their language. And remember, my concern is always going to be, I'm looking at disproportionality and special education. We also had the students complete reflection papers. We love our reflection papers as professors. So they had a reflection paper, and we had a lot of great comments. I really love this no rhyme or reason comment where the student made comment that, I didn't know. I really just thought they were talking to each other and had to get the gist of what each other was saying. I had no idea, that that this is a rule-based language, and they really were able to value not only this instruction that we provided them, but also learn to, value AAVE. They, again, these are just more reflection papers that of the students that participated, and it was an aha moment for a lot of them. That they understood for the first time how different the languages really are. Again, it was hard. It was hard for them, which makes me, it makes me smile a little bit, because there's some value in realizing that our students are speaking a very different language, and that you don't understand and should take the time to get to learn. It also created this sense of affirmation, right, for the students that are coming to school with this language. And if our teachers can get to a place where they're embracing that, man, that's huge. If they're valuing and seeing the value in the language that's being spoken by the students, it shows value in who they are as a person, and what's important to them and what they're bringing with them. So that's huge. These are just some inclusive strategies that I've, kind of embodied in my work. When I really started to do this kind of work, as was mentioned, I've got like 25 years in the field in speech language pathology, and it's a broad field. We do birth to 99 in all kinds of settings, but my favorite is the last thing that I did working in urban education, with school-age children that were especially teenagers, and really trying to embrace this inclusive intervention strategies. As I was starting to do these evaluations, right? And I'm like, okay, it's a stool, they're saying seat, but you know what? That's okay. You asked for, I was looking for autograph here, but you said, your number. So, I'm taking all these things in, and I'm just like, okay, how can we help make these connections of your language with this other language that's been expected in this test? So there's some different inclusive interventions that I've used or kind of embraced through that work. And one of them starting with just trying to help them feel valued and honor, the language that they have already, bringing in speakers, or showing that I'm bi-dialectal, I can speak AAVE too. Bringing that into the classroom setting alone was transformational for a lot of the students that I was working with. One of the other platforms that I used was MTSS, to provide those connections. Mostly in the younger grades, I was able to do this pretty seamlessly, where I just went into all of the preschool and kindergarten and first grade classrooms to provide some of that instruction that would allow them to make these connections of these two different languages. I called them just whole group language and whole group sessions that I would provide to entire classrooms. I didn't, it was a lot of work and a lot of time, but it was worth it, to be able to work with all of my youth. Before the referral, I could tell the teacher, like, there's nothing wrong with him. No, but I will help to make these connections between their language and this language you're expecting of them. I'll come to your whole classroom. And I did that through the MTSS model, multi-tiered system of support. That tier 1 instruction just means everybody. So I just made a decision that everybody in kindergarten, everybody in first grade would be able to benefit from my knowledge of language and being bi-dialectal. And I just brought that to the whole classroom. It was also my way of kind of educating staff about bi-dialectalism and the differences in the languages and the expectation level there. That proved to be highly successful for me. And this is what I'm talking about, right? I'm sure you guys have seen this slide. It's still so powerful, especially when you add that reality on there, right? we've got equality, everybody gets the same thing, all size fits all. But that's not helpful to the kiddo, right, on the right side, who still can't see over the fence, who still doesn't have access to the instruction that they actually need. Equity allows for that, right? It allows for, hey, this kiddo this whole group, this whole classroom might need this whole district might need something a little different, and providing a different level of support. That's what I was doing with MTSS and that tier 1 instruction, because in fact, in reality, the kids who need the most oftentimes get the least. And that's when I made those connections, right, of how do we help our youth understand that, oh my gosh, you have this beautiful, rich language and culture that you already have. How can I partner that with the level of instruction we're expecting from you here at school? In reality, there is very little opportunity for that partnership. Why do I care? Because there's a literacy crisis here in America, and Black students are disproportionately affected by that. The statistics are alarming, actually, that 50% of our Black fourth graders are reading below that basic level. And again, I will always point to differences in language and culture as a causation, or as a factor that should be heavily considered, and how we can differentiate our instruction when we're dealing with whole different communities. I don't believe in that one size fits all model, which is why I look at these statistics and I cringe and I think, well, if there was a different level of instruction, we may get different level of results. I also kind of cringe at that term achievement gap because, well, for a couple reasons. One, I feel like it puts the onus on the student, like it's something they did, to not achieve. But the other reason I really cringe at that is because reading isn't directly connected to only academics. It's connected to your ability to access the world. So as far as I'm concerned, it's an opportunity gap. And therefore a civil rights issue that I have been addressing head on as it relates to the Black community, and particularly AAVE speakers. And remember, over 80% of my students, or of Black students, are AAVE speakers. And so this opportunity gap that it's causing for my AAVE speakers is alarming. So I've spent a lot of time really addressing that and researching that. I've already brought up Lisa Delpit. She's a wonder. She's been screaming about this for decades, and I'm here to add my voice to hers. That explicit instruction for my AAVE speakers and Black communities in particular, and affirming that language and culture is the number one way to address these differences in the opportunities that are afforded to our students, and especially as it relates to reading. It'll show up first in academics, but then the impact of that is long and far-reaching. So I'm adding my voice to what Lisa Delpit has already been talking about for decades, to really allow for that explicit instruction for our Black students. These are the 5 pillars of literacy. And if you look at them, you'll see we've talked about, most of these already, right? As it relates to the differences between AAVE and mainstream American English. And they're vast, they're huge. There's a whole book on it. So really looking at these pillars as it relates to instruction, explicit instruction to our AAVE speakers, and making those changes and differentiation so that our AAVE speakers can access that content head on and in a culturally responsive manner. And it's imperative. We had that picture of equity and what that looks like. Okay, it's imperative that we provide that direct instruction and consider all 5 pillars of literacy if we really think we're going to make a dent in the skill set of our Black students, for sure. Reading is a culturally constructed act. We've got Dr. Geneva Gay. I'm sure many of you have already heard of her work in culturally responsive teaching. That's what I'm talking about. Using texts that are relevant to the students, validating those voices that are and the language that's coming. That the students are coming with, using a curriculum that benefits the student and reflects their culture. That is the best way. Research has already proven this time and time again, that that's one way to address our AAVE speakers, especially those coming from the Black community. And then looking at meaning from this cultural lens, and using those strategies that will adequately address that gap in equity where we have in reality, our kids are getting the least amount, because a lot of times we're using not only strategies, but then we're also using materials that are not relevant or culturally appropriate for them. So really tying all that in. One way I have thrown my name in the hat is I've started this program called Beyond the Margins. It's a restorative literacy initiative where I'm working with 14 to 18-year-old youth here in the south suburbs of Chicago. This came about because the director of this program, Redeploy, came to my faculty meeting and asked for help excuse me, with reading for his students. And so I asked more questions and found they were all Black males. And so immediately I was like, this one's for me. I reached out to my colleagues, two of which are on this call, and we created this program called Beyond the Margins, which has a restorative literacy lens. And that just means it's pairing structured literacy with restorative practices. So we're doing, peace circles and reflection on social emotional learning, using content that's relevant to the students. We're also embracing translanguaging, university design for learning, which allows the youth to show me their understanding in any way that they choose. So it doesn't have to be any of the static, typical ways that you might demonstrate learning, like a test. They can create a project. And so I had 5 boys working on this very initiative with me this particular semester. We're going to do it again next semester. Together, there were special education, who's on the call, psych and counseling, myself, speech language pathology, and then we had social work involved too, to run these circles, to use a trauma-informed approach to really identify and affirm their language, their culture. We chose a book, The Long Way Down. If you guys haven't read this, I do recommend it. It's like a super quick, easy read. It's fast. And it's about a young man who's living in a community that has gangs, and he just experienced the death of his brother. And he's going through a series of choices and decisions to decide how he's going to respond. As you might imagine, that lended itself very easily to be able to work on language, vocabulary, sentence structure, but also to provide some emotional healing and discussion as a group and individually, and how it relates to them and their own personal journey. They all had to put together projects, and then they showcased them together. We just did that last week. It was so wonderful. I made certificates for everybody. 2 of the young men put together a podcast and what they've learned. They wrote a bunch of questions out, and all the interns were very helpful. helping them with the questions, and they interviewed me. They had some deep questions too. They were like, what's your greatest failure and what did you do about it? I was like, dang. So there was a lot of there were a lot of really great discussions. One young man created a beautiful painting of his journey to success, is what he labeled it. He was also getting some individualized instruction for reading. Um, and then we had another young man who just put together a PowerPoint of his goals in life. They were able to showcase that for the community. And we had about 40, 50 people come to that. It was really exciting. The youth have chosen Punching the Air to read next semester. So we'll be kicking that off in a couple months. But it was a great pilot, and it was a great opportunity to affirm who they are. These books are written largely in AAVE as well. So it allowed our youth to be able to engage with the material as teenagers in a way that they could see themselves and work on these skills and read a book. Some of them communicated for the very first time. And the showcase was really meant for them to feel successful and a win for them, because everybody needs a win, right? And I do believe from their input that it did just that. So one of my call to action is to, continue in this work with me, to embrace bidialectalism and empower our students who, especially our Black students who are AAVE speakers, work to design programs like I just did, right, with Beyond the Margins, work to design programs that are community informed and context aware, that's going to be beneficial for the youth that you're serving, and lead with urgency. We have our Black students are falling behind, and I will always point to the differences in language and culture and the lack of ways that we have to address that directly and to partner school systems directly. We've got bilingual education, we got we got all these things, but our students who speak AAVE aren't really in a place right now in any school district that I know of that's really embracing them as bidialectal. So lead with urgency for our students, because it's not an achievement gap, it's an opportunity gap. And really, it starts at school. That's all I have. Are there any questions?
Hi, Dr. O'Quinn. Thank you so much for your presentation. Yes, if we have any questions from the audience, feel free to add them to the chat now. But while folks are thinking of their questions, we have maybe time for one or two. I'll start with one. And my first question, this is the Zara Institute for Restorative Justice. We're really interested in restorative practices, and it's so cool and interesting to hear how you're leaning into RJ practices in this work of literacy justice. And so you mentioned the use of restorative circles. I'm curious, what in particular about restorative justice practices like circle practice lends themselves well to this work of literacy justice from your perspective?
For me, we used a lot of restorative circles for Beyond the Margins this semester. And what I found is that it provides the youth with great opportunity to feel the sense of community, and then feel safe and confident in their ability to share in this one small circle. Because the content and the books that we are reading are so dense and heavy, it's easy to pull out some of those really in-depth conversations. And what I found was that over time, the youth felt much more comfortable not only sharing from their own life, but asking questions that were really deep and involved, and sparked a larger conversation, maybe even that we didn't have planned or considered initially. But yeah, it really proved to be very emotional at times, and very thought-provoking, which was really exciting.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, it's really interesting to think about like the restorative justice community building aspect and how, yeah, young people are having the opportunity through Beyond the Margins to connect through literacy, but also through language, hearing the language that they speak being reflected by those around them and being able to go at their own pace in sharing. I just think that that's really foundation or really cool, really profound.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm curious, in your context or in other contexts that you're familiar with, are you seeing any sort of like movement in terms of the embracing of AAVE in schools? You know, Beyond the Margins, as I understand it, sort of perhaps in partnership with schools, but outside of schools. Have you seen any sort of movement for that embrace within schools?
I wish I could say that there's more. It's slowly but surely, you know, people are starting to get to a place where they're understanding and respecting AAVE. As I mentioned, even in that survey that I completed, within a 10 years time, when I compare my results to ones that were collected maybe a little over 10 years ago, we have moved that needle, at least of acceptance of AAVE, in the neutral zone, but not necessarily positive, in terms of like, okay, now even if I recognize it, what do I do with it? So, you know, we're still at the very forefront and beginning stages of identifying and explaining to educators how they can be instrumental in partnering AAVE with mainstream American English in the classroom setting.
Yeah. And I can imagine, you know, and I'm curious if you've seen this with sort of new attacks on like diversity, equity, and inclusion in education spaces. I can imagine that that has made sort of moves towards that embracing even more difficult, for lack of a better word. Is that something you're experiencing as well?
Absolutely. I mean, we're fortunate enough to live in Illinois where, you know, we do have a governor and mayors with, you know, huge bullhorns where I am at, that are really kind of protecting us from some of those quick changes in DEI or really hard, fast changes in our institutions. But globally, yes. I mean, it has been difficult, to say the least, to try to continue to have these conversations about pushing AAVE, you know, forward in how it relates to instruction in the classroom setting, because of the socio-political climate we're all experiencing right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you for that. And to not leave on that maybe sort of dour note, I'm going to throw your information back up. And just any last word in terms of how people can reach out to you, how they can support, or any just last words of wisdom you'd share.
Yeah, thank you again for having me. I love to talk about this stuff. My family will tell you I talk about it nonstop. It's my passion. It's what I love. So please feel free to reach out to me at the email address that's on the screen. I would love to further the conversation and talk to you about how we can work together to really help our youth, our Black youth that are AAVE speakers, and how we can help them, how we can work together to empower them and improve their ability to access quality education, especially as it relates to literacy. So please feel free to reach out anytime.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Again, thank you, Dr. O'Quinn, for joining us. I have a few last minute announcements for folks if they'll stick around. As I've been saying the last few webinars, the Zare Institute is a proud signatory of this manifesto for restorative justice and human rights, which has been spearheaded by the European Forum for Restorative Justice. I believe today the European Forum is re-releasing with new signatories, but the manifesto is still there for you to read and I believe to sign. So please do that. This is, I think, a really important frontier in the restorative justice movement, understanding restorative justice as a human right and its connection to other human rights. And then last but not least, as always, if you want to learn more about our work at the Zaire Institute, what we're doing to uplift voices like Dr. O'Quinn's and others in this movement, please go to our website and feel free to support us there. And with that, I send you all away with good wishes. Please nourish yourselves. And if you have the opportunity, nourish someone else. And we will see you next year for a whole new slate of webinars and offerings. Thank you so, so much.